Well, so welcome to the February edition of the Cafe Seminar Series. So as Ramin just said, we encourage you to turn on your videos so we can see you. So today, Marieke Bos from the Swedish House of Finance is presenting her paper entitled Corporate Restructuring and Employees' Mental Health. This is joined with Laurent Bach, Ramin, Baghai, and Silva. And we're also delighted that Paige, Ouimet from UNC Chapel Hill will be giving the discussion. So as usual, there will be 40 minutes for the presentation, 20 minutes for the discussion, and 15 minutes for Q&A. Marieke, the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Laurent, Ramin, and Kim for giving me this opportunity to present. And of course, we want to thank Paige for accepting to discuss this paper. This is very preliminary work, so we're very eager to get feedback. So yeah, that might have been more cumbersome for Paige because the paper, we've written up just the paper, so it's in a not perfect stage to say the least. So as Laurent already said, this is a joint work with Ramin, Laurent and Rui, and I think Laurent and Rui are here as well. So to motivate our work, I wanted to give you from all perspectives the importance of our question. So if you think about continually changing economic environment, then it might be necessary for a firm to reorganize in order to prosper and survive. And if what I wanted to illustrate with this figure is really that also in terms of value, and this is a figure expressed in billions of US dollars, there is a lot of value involved, and this has been growing over time. But then to take it closer to home, if you think about how many employees are actually affected by restructuring of the firm, where this calculation I could only do for our own data. So if you think about the number of firms that are annually affected by restructuring, then these are less than 2% of all firms. If you look at all the employees that work at the firms that are actually restructuring, then it's on an annual basis approximately 5 to 6% of all employees in Sweden that are affected by such restructurings. And then maybe abundant to mention, especially during COVID, being mentally healthy is actually very important for your well-being. So in that sense, this could be a key building block towards a more sustainable workforce and economy. And yeah, this literature is very, very fast. So there is a strong and robust negative correlation between life satisfaction and mental illness. And then if you think about disabilities, so depression is one of the leading causes for disabilities. And even more scary, even though depression is of course not a necessary condition, it's often a precursory state before you commit suicide. And if you look at suicide rates, then this is the second leading cause for people in the age of 15 to 29-year-olds, and still the sixth leading cause, which I thought was very surprising, if you look at the age group of 15 to 49-year-olds. Okay, and then from the perspective of the firm, of course, you might care about your employees in general, and human capital is also important for, of course, your productivity and profitability. So if you consider to restructure, it is important to not only look at the financial outcomes, but look at all costs and benefits of such a decision. So hence we argue that it's also important to look at the mental health of your human capital. Then lastly, if you think about from a societal perspective, then mental health is very costly. So this is an estimation done by the OECD, where they look at direct effects, so direct effects in terms of healthcare costs, and indirect effects in terms of loss of productivity. And here you can see the darkest color represents 4.7% to 5.40% of GDP. So these costs are substantial. And I wanted to emphasize, because this came up in other presentations, it's not true that in the north, where you see the color is dark, that we see a higher prevalence of mental illness. So these color differences are basically driven by different cost allocations, fighting the same level of mental illness. Okay, so the question we want to answer in this paper is if does and how restructuring of the firm affects the mental health of its employees. So the way we're going to do that so far is that we're utilizing a panel data set where we link employer and employees to their health medical records and background information from the tax authority, for example. So we're running this panel regression where we're looking where we have a post dummy, so it's a one difference, and we control for age, individual sector times years, fixed effects. And we cluster because we believe there might be correlation in the variation within a firm in mental illness. We cluster our estimations on a firm level. So what does it mean? So what we can do is that we can hold constant the average mental health of an employee, because there might be a trend within your, the resilience of the individual. We can hold constant trends across age groups, and this you can see if you look at the data. You see an overall trend that older cohorts tend to have a higher prevalence of diagnosis and medication uptake. And then, as in all Western countries, there is a huge time trend. So we need to control for calendar year fixed effects. And then lastly, to control for the average mental health within a sector in a specific year. So if there is a sector hit by a specific shock, and this causes in the whole sector an increase in mental health, then we also hold that constant. Okay. But ideally, of course, you would like to have a random event. So these merger events are non-random, and hence our coefficient or our parameter of interest, beta, is likely to be, is not only picking up the causal effect, but also confounding factors. So one element that you might worry about is reverse causality. So it could be true that if you have a firm with employees that are mentally ill, that this might lead to the restructuring of the firm by itself. Then secondly, there might be an issue of selection. So the employees that choose to work in a firm that is restructuring might have certain preferences that is both correlated with the likelihood to be mentally ill, but also with the likelihood to work for a certain firm. So that those two confounding factors are in addition to the causal effect that we're interested in, which is the effect of a merger to the state of your mental health. So ideally, of course, you would like to have, you look at all the employees that work at firms and you randomly assign firms to be restructuring. So this is not what we do. So I wanted to place the caveat. So we think, so if you look at reverse causality, it seems that it's unlikely that this plays a big role, because if we compare employees that work for firms that are merging versus employees that work for firms that are not merging, there is a large difference, a positive difference in the mental health of individuals that work for firms that do merge. So we think that this effect is not likely to play a big role, but the selection, so we cannot control for unobservables, that does play a role. And so how does this affect the interpretation of our result is that we think that there is, it is unlikely that the effects that we find will hold for the average employee in Swedish society. So the effects that we find are internally sound, and So they hold for individuals that work for firms that merge, but we are unsure if this is an overestimation or an underestimation for individuals that work for different kinds of firms. Okay, that said, what do we find? So we find that mergers have a negative effect on the mental health of employees. This is not completely obvious because you could think about, if you think about a merger, so if you work at a relatively small firm, which is typically the case, the target firm is smaller than the acquirer firm, it might be true that if you're absorbed by a larger firm, this creates more stability in your job. You have a larger and more sound firm that you will be part of that might create job opportunities and more less uncertainty. But we find a negative effect. So what we find is that relative to the pre-merger mental health, we find that when we first look at like a general indicator of your health, we look at the chance of you going to an outpatient care increases by 2%, and the likelihood of seeking inpatient care increased by 5%. So the reason why we do that is that within the health literature, people want to decide, because there's such large selection into diagnosis, you also want to capture like the overall tendency of people to seek health outside a diagnosis. So one of the two indicators that are used most commonly in this literature is really to see like how often do you go to the ER, how often do you seek medical help. So this is why we do these first two variables. But then looking explicitly at mental health variables, we see that there is an increase in the likelihood to be diagnosed with a mental illness, that you take psychiatric medication, and antidepressants is a subset of this psychiatric medication. You're also more likely to report sick if you have a job. This is an increase by 11%. And then lastly, the risk of dying increases by 30%. But I want to really play this a little bit down because this comes from a very low level. And I will also explain why this increase is slightly, it's difficult to capture because we want people to work at the firm, so you need to be alive to work first. So it's not easy to identify this. So and then in order to see if this effect is large or small, we compared it to other events in an individual's life, and we find that the negative effect that we find from a merger is equal to the positive effect in size, in terms of size, to getting married. And then, of course, that was the average effect. What we then do is look at a heterogeneous effect of individuals or employees that are differently exposed to mental health. And what we find is that females, so compared to the baseline effect, so the average effect, the effect for females is 7 times larger. And employees that leave to unemployment experience a 5 times larger effect. Employees that have a below the median cognitive skills or lower education experience a 3 times larger effect. And the same is true for horizontal mergers, it's 3 times as large. Okay, so how does a merger affect your mental health? So you can think about several channels. So in terms of mental health, what is very important is anxiety. So you're worried about your circumstances. So in that sense, a merger might increase your uncertainty, and the uncertainty increases in many dimensions. It might increase in terms of your wage prospects, in terms of your unemployment risk. It might create uncertainty about the content of your job and the colleagues that you have, so the work environment. Yeah, and so these are the channels that we're going to explore in this paper, and we try to find indicators for each of these channels to look at that. And in light of the time, I'm gonna go very briefly over the contribution to the literature. So our paper brings together two strains of the literature, one on mergers and acquisitions, and the other one on the determinants of mental illness. And then I wanted to highlight the paper which is most relevant in this setting, by Garcia, Maug, and PreMerger. This is a working paper, and they look at the pre-deal from private equity buyout, the health status in the pre-deal, how that predicts your employment outcomes of the workers afterwards, after the private equity buyout. And they observe the intake of medication. So in turn, if you compare our contribution to theirs, then we look not only at private equity buyouts, we look at all mergers. And furthermore, we don't restrict ourselves to only the targets. We also look at the acquirer firm. And then we have a much broader set of variables that we can both control for or look at, because we have their full medical records, or nearly full. Yeah, so let's skip about the health economic literature, which is very fast, of course. I might come back if I have time left over. So our sample, so we use the Swedish yearly panel, and we're covering 10 years between 2006 and 2015. And we selected the firms that have at least 4 employees and are incorporated. And the employees, we restrict that they must work at a firm that will experience a merger. And we do this, we make this restriction 1 year before the merger. We experienced, and we tried, of course, also to place this restriction further back in time, but it doesn't influence our estimation significantly. But this is a very important notion. So we require the individual to work at the firm 1 year before the merger. And afterwards we let go, and before we also let go. So you can work at different firms afterwards and before. And what we end up with this sample of analysis is 560,000 employees that work at 150 firms. And of these firms, 5,600 firms experienced 1 or more mergers, and then 3,400 unique mergers. So you can see that these employees work at different firms, not only at the firms that have a merger afterwards or before. And you can also see that there are some firms that have more than 1 merger. Okay, and then for each firm, we observe the Swedish company registration office. So we see date stamped the start of the merger and the ending of the merger. We see if you're the target or the acquirer, and we see firm accounting characteristics. And then for each employee, we see their medical records. And so we see date stamped diagnosis, and this is we only see this in the secondary care system. So this is what I meant with a nearly complete medical record. We don't see, if you go to your primary care doctor, we don't see if you get a diagnosis there. And that could be significant, because there is a recent trend that more primary care doctors actually give you a diagnosis, and not only a specialist care. But what we can compensate this lack of observations in the primary care, we can see all prescription drugs, both prescribed in the primary and secondary care. So if your primary care doctor diagnosed you with a mental illness, it's very likely that you will also be prescribed drugs, and that we will then capture. Okay, and then we match these employees also to Statistics Sweden, so we can see, basically what you can dream of from my perspective. So we see all the employee-employer information, so your tenure, your rank in your job, and all your background information also on your family. Yeah, and then we lastly, relevant for this project, we matched to the death registry. So we can see the date and the cause of your death. And okay, and we also matched it for the guys in our sample to the military conscript test data. So we can see your IQ and non-cognitive test scores that you did during conscript. Okay, let's look at the summary statistics. So this, we measure the characteristics of all the employees 1 year before the merger. So these are the characteristics 1 year before the merger. And what I pointed out here are the ones that are different from the general population. So you can see that our sample are more likely to be male, sorry. So 60% male, and a slightly less large population with a foreign background. And then I wanted to highlight, and this variable we will use in our paper a lot. So we made like a summary health variable, mental health variable, that is either if you're diagnosed with a mental illness or you take medication for a mental illness. And so we call that mental health. Maybe not the ideal name. And so what is notable is that you can see that almost 10% in our sample is either taking psychiatric medication or is diagnosed with a mental illness. And relative to the general population, this is slightly less than the general population in the pre-period. Okay, as I said, I'm going to show you no tables. I'm only going to show, or maybe one table. I'm only going to show figures. And I wanted to start with an event time plot where we plot the coefficients of the regression that I described earlier for the estimation, the panel estimation of your mental health for each event time over the merger. But one thing that is important to note, that if I plot it over the event time, I can no longer control for individual fixed effects because that's collinear with event time for each individual. And oh yeah, as the benchmark, we normalize it at 3 years before the event time. And so the point I want to make with these event time plots, so the first two plots are the likelihood to be an inpatient, so stay overnight at the hospital. And the second to the right is this plot, is the likelihood to be seek help at, but not overnight. So you seek help, the ER would be an example. These, so you see, we start at -5, so 5 years before the merger, and at 0, there is the merger. And the point I wanted to make with these event time plots is that how quickly does the effect that we find revert to the pre-period state of your mental health. And so you can see that only for inpatient, this is a very persistent effect. So this lasts more than 8 years. But normally you see that these effects revert to the same level after 5 years, approximately. And so, yeah, the action that you see in the pre-period is actually driven by the individual fixed effect. So when we played around, we first thought this might be the uncertainty about the merger. And so we played around if this could be steered by the announcement of the merger, for example. But as it turns out, this completely disappears if you control for individual fixed effect. But nevertheless, there is value in looking at the event time plots because this can give you an idea how persistent the effect is over time. Okay, so then we wanted to get an idea about the size of the effect, so the economic size of the effect that we find for mergers. And what we do, because it could be true that, I mean, at some point I really started to believe this, that individuals that work for firms that will experience emergence, that these individuals are very robust. I mean, their mental health is much more robust than individuals that work for different firms. So we wanted to see, okay, among all these employees that work at firms that merge, do they have other events in their life that actually shock their mental health in a different manner? Or are they never affected? So they're just, you know, They're never truly shaken. And so what we do, we look at our merger event effect, and we keep the scale constant. And then we look at other events like divorce, a spell of unemployment, and then a full year of unemployment. So you have really no unemployment, your marriage, and then the birth of your first child. And so the point of these graphs is really to get an idea for the same group of people, although of course not everybody experiences a divorce and not everybody experiences a firstborn. You can see that the merger events, the size of the effect, and again, we're looking at the graphs where we cannot control for individual fixed effect. We see that they, so these are different, so the event times are different. So this is the event time of a merger, this is the event time of a divorce. And you can see that the merger event is qualitatively similar to the effect of a marriage, but luckily the reverse sign. And then you see, yeah, that divorce is much more, it's 5 times as large, or at least 5 times as large than the effect that you experience from a merger. And also full-time unemployment is much larger than a merger. Okay, but that was the average effect, no? So now we're going to look at maybe there are groups that the average hides, and there are groups that experience a much larger effect, economically more significant, that are just averaged out in the average effect. So we're going to look at different demographics, different skill levels, in order to try to understand what the mechanism is, how you get mentally distressed by a merger. So the way we're going to do that, here you see all the outcome variables. We run the same regression, and now we can control for individual fixed effects. And in order to compare the size of the coefficients, we're going to normalize it by the pre-period standard deviation. So they're all in the same terms, and the interpretation becomes, I would say, irrelevant. But the point of this exercise is really to see the relative size of the effect compared to the baseline. So this is then how we visualize the average effect. And what we're going to do, we're going to plot the heterogeneous effect in different colors while we keep the gray as the baseline in order to judge how far you deviate. And a dark color means significance, and a gray color means insignificance. Yes. Oh yeah. So yeah. Okay, let's start by gender. So we're going to look at gender and foreign background. So even though in the literature there is no evidence of an intrinsic difference between males and females, we do have a documented evidence that women are more likely to acknowledge health problems in general and mental health problems specifically. And of course, if you acknowledge it, that also enables you to seek help. And women do this. They do this earlier than men. So in that respect, we expect women to have a larger observable suffering. So you can actually observe the diagnosis and the treatment. And then for individuals with a foreign background, there is some evidence in the opposite direction that individuals with a foreign background face higher barriers to healthcare. Either this could be a language barriers, this could be a lack of knowledge of the system, or pure discrimination. And this then leads also afterwards to the diminished likelihood of them seeking help. So we expect for individuals with a foreign background the opposite. And this is how it looks like. So in red, you see the marginal effect of being female versus male. And then in gray, you see the baseline effect. So again, the purpose of these graphs is not to interpret the exactly size of the coefficient, but more the relative deviation from the baseline. And so what you can see that women are more likely to be an outpatient And then here you have this mental health summary variable. So they are much more likely to experience a mental health distress. So they're 7 times more likely, I will tell you, I will see you later. So even though they're much more likely to be documented as in mental distress, you can also see that they're less likely to die and commit suicide. So it might be true that men and women suffer equally much, but because women acknowledge their problems and seek help, I mean, now I speculate, of course, but this might prevent them to die earlier and commit suicide. And then for foreigners or individuals with foreign-born background, you can see that they don't deviate that much from the baseline, but they do have a lower probability to take psychiatric medication compared to the baseline, which is in line with what we would expect. So next, we're looking at the age. So if you look at the general population, I have another paper about this, then you can see that, if you look at the different cohorts, the expression of mental health, so there is this selection into the diagnosis. No? So it's not necessarily true that this difference between cohorts that we observe reflects the true difference. But at least if you look at the diagnosis level and the uptake of medication, you can see that this increases if you become older. So in that sense, you expect that older people might be more sensitive. But then again, you can also see that older employees might benefit from better labor protection laws. But so here are the results, and you can see that actually there is no significant difference when we compare these 3 groups. We only see in depth, and that is totally logic with the age group. So young people are less likely to die, and older people are more likely to die. Yeah. So then I need to speed up a little bit because of time. So next we're going to look at skills and intrinsic abilities. Highly skilled workers, of course, might be able to adjust to a changing environment better, or they just have better outside options, and this makes them worry less. And so first we look at all the males, because for them we see the military conscript tests, and then you see that if you have a below the medium IQ or a below the medium non-cognitive test, we see the largest effects for individuals that have the below medium non-cognitive tests. And because these are only males, we wanted to look at a variable that encompasses women as well. So we look at individuals that have only high school education versus individuals that have more than high school. And we see not large differences for them. But we do see this negative deviation between the likelihood to be an in and out patient. Then you might think that this education completely maps into blue-collar workers, but that's not true. There are blue-collar workers that are actually higher educated. So yeah, we find slightly different results. And then related to, of course, the results we find for age, we look now at the tenure. So we look at the tenure outside our panel as well, the length of your tenure at the firm. And yeah, we don't find huge difference. So that's in line with the age results as well. So then in the health literature, there is this large documentation of the link between the risk to lose your job and your mental health problems. So obviously this could play a big role in terms of mergers. So if you think about the target versus the acquirer, then the people who work at a target firm, they are more likely to be unemployed, but this is not huge. So first we look at the target versus the acquirer, and you see compared to the baseline, we actually don't see large deviations. And then, okay, maybe it's really that we should look at the leavers, so people who are leaving for either unemployment or another job. And again, we don't find this huge deviation. Of course, if you don't have a job, you cannot report sick at your job. So there is this negative coefficient. But again, this is a combination of people who leave voluntarily versus non-voluntarily. So let's then look at people who actually leave to unemployment. That's maybe not the preferred state for everyone. And then if you look at like small unemployment durations, we don't find larger effect. But if you look at individuals that at least are 1 year unemployed, you start to see quite large effects compared to the baseline. And these effects in the mental health variable are 5 times larger, for example. Then, of course, if you think about the stayers, so it might be true that even if you stay, so you're not fired, you might still be in distress because you might have a different perspective on your promotion. You have different colleagues, different work environment, a different task. So this might increase your distress. And if you see, we look at people who stay and not get promoted versus people who stay and do get promoted, then we see, which I thought was nice to see, that as we would expect, the anxiety among this group that didn't get promoted is much higher than the baseline, for example. And then the other measure, which I'm not sure we programmed completely correct yet, is that we look at below, so people who stay within your rank, what is the percentage of people that still come from your old workplace? So are you surrounded by more people from the new firm versus the old firm? And this gives a larger effects for the mental illness, mental health variable, but you see there's a high variation, high variance in it. It's not a very precise estimate. Okay, and then I don't think I have much time, but we look at firm characteristics. So we look at horizontal mergers versus vertical mergers or conglomerate mergers, and we look at the relative size of the merger. And so we find for the horizontal merger, we find larger effects, especially if it becomes more horizontal. So you have more numbers in the sector definition together. And then for the relative size, we also find a larger effect for the larger difference. Okay, and then the last thing I guess I'm going to show is about the pre-merger financial distressed firms. So employees that work at firms that were already distressed, the firms were distressed in the period before the merger, and we look at the level of leverage as an indicator of financial distress of the firm. You can see these are raw plots of the data, that if you compare a stronger difference, so firms with above and below the median leverage, you don't give you a large difference, but if you go to the extreme, so the lowest 5% versus the highest 95%, you can see that the individuals who work at the highest 95% increase their, and again, I'm looking at this summary variable of mental health. The deviation is quite large with each other, and that's what you can see. Okay, and so this is a table of all our facts, and so I have 4 more minutes. So the thing that I wanted to point out, so even if we look at these different heterogeneous effects, I wanted to also make you aware of the share of employees that are actually affected by this heterogeneous effect. So we already know there are only 40% women working at firms. So compared to the baseline effect, so which is 100%, for women we find this 7 times larger effect. But then there are only 40% women at these firms. So I'm now only circling the effects that are significant at the 1% level. And so I wanted to, so if you have below non-cognitive skills, below the medium, the effect is almost 5 times as large, but there are 13% of the employees that have non-cognitive skills below the median. And people who leave towards 1 year at least unemployment, there are 7% of these individuals. So the effect is 5.5 times larger than the baseline. And then if you look at the horizontal, for example, 31%. Yeah, just to give you an illustration, like how representative these effects are for the overall effect. Okay, yeah, then we were working on twins, but I'm going to skip that. So to conclude, well, we document that employees that work at the firm that is gonna merge will suffer negatively mental health consequences. And these effects are concentrated in the 5 years after the merger. And so these effects are not only concentrated at the target firms, we also observe these distress among the employees of acquirer firms. And as I said, they're most pronounced for females, individuals that are at risk to be unemployed with low abilities and a diminished promotion prospect or having horizontal merger. So to summarize, we think we contribute by putting new evidence on the table that suggests that if you look at the normal indicators for labor market outcomes that we use in economics and finance, like employment and wages, they might not fully capture the impact of corporate actions on the employees' well-being. So,
well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
For presenting this rich set of facts. Paige, Ouimet will now give the discussion.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. So it's very important for us to be able to understand how M&As impact employees. And there is a modest literature that has looked at this, but it's primarily focused on 2 employee outcomes, which is going to be, do you keep your job and your wages? And we've focused on those 2 outcomes because this is really the only data we've tended to observe. And so what this paper does, this great innovation, is now they're able to look at mental health. And clearly, if we want to know how an M&A is impacting employees, then mental health is going to be a key indicator. So the sort of big headline point of my discussion, this is very cool. This is a very important paper. I expect it's going to be well cited. Also, this paper, the methodological approach is really straightforward. This is just a series of diff and diffs. And the authors are extremely descriptive of their data. So I think it is something like 60+ tables and figures. So I feel like I really got to know what they're seeing in the data. And I am completely convinced this baseline of effect that following an M&A event, there's this increase in these mental health events. I'm 100% sold. So for the rest of my discussion, what I'm going to talk about is some additional tests and maybe some additional context that may help the authors to really push interpretation as tightly as they can. And then I just also want to point out a couple of the cross-sectional tests. They do a ton in the paper. They're really interesting. The 3 that stood out most to me would be that they're finding these stronger treatment effects when they look at employees of the target firm, when they look at blue-collar workers, and workers who leave their job and go into unemployment. Okay, so my first comment is on selection and seeking treatment. So to be clear, the authors don't directly observe underlying mental health. What they observe is that somebody goes in and sees a doctor and either gets a diagnosis or starts receiving some sort of medication associated with curing mental illness, conditional on having the mental illness. And so why is it important to think about this distinction? And the reason is that it could be some groups of employees may be more likely to seek treatment given an underlying increase in mental illness. And in fact, the authors suggest this when they document this fact that women have this higher treatment effect. So post M&As, women are more likely to load on this mental health indicator. They argue this is going on because women are more likely to seek treatment. I completely agree. But I think if this logic applies to women, then I think it's important to think about that with any of these cross-sectional cuts. And I think where it's going to actually bite is it's going to show that some of these results are probably even stronger than they're already reporting. So the one that stands out to me is they show that blue-collar workers have a much stronger treatment effect. And at least my prior, and I realize this is a bit kind of pulling out of the air, but my prior is that blue-collar workers relative to high-skill employees are going to be less likely to seek medical treatment for mental illness than high-skilled workers. And so the fact that they're finding a stronger treatment effect suggests to me that the underlying increase in mental health is actually even bigger among these workers. The other reason why I bring it up is it is possible, although I don't think this is what is going on, that their effects are not driven by a change in underlying mental health, but instead by a change in your tendency to seek treatment. So trying to think through sort of a reasonable story about how this could happen, the one that comes to my mind is that you're working along at the M&A company, suddenly you lose your job, you have more time. Given that you have more time, you go into the doctor for some sort of underlying condition you've had all along, but you just haven't been in a rush to get it treated. And the good thing is I think the authors can exclude this relatively easily. So my suggestion would be to look at some underlying health condition that is not going to be affected by the M&A. And so what I was thinking about would be a mole. So the fact that you have a mole that looks possibly a little bit uneven is not going to be associated with whether or not your firm has an M&A. But I can see something where you see that mole and you think, I know I'm supposed to go into a dermatologist to have this checked out, but whether I do it next month or I do it next year may relate to how busy I am. And so I think it'd be easy for the authors to just look at a couple of these types of conditions, see that there's no change post M&A, and then exclude this possible concern. So my second point is going to be on marginal contribution. And to be clear, not to argue that they don't have a marginal contribution. I'm sold on this paper, but I think I would pitch their marginal contribution a little bit different than the way they're doing it in the paper. And I lean more heavily on the existing literature showing this link between going into unemployment, losing your job, and mental health. And so there's this big literature that directly documents that, and I cite a couple of papers here on the slide. But this literature has always had problems, and it has these problems because of just massive amounts of endogeneity. Is it that the job loss led to the higher mental illness? Or is it that declining mental illness led to the job loss? And these papers try to do the best they can, but it's always been a critique of this literature. And so one thing I think would be useful for the authors to point out is they can talk about this, but get away from some of this endogeneity. To the extent that we believe that the M&A is not directly caused by the underlying mental health of the workers, then we have sort of more of an exogenous shock to employment. And in that sense, I think it links more closely to this other literature from the health economics, which looks at community job losses. So let's just look at things like plant closures. And then let's just measure mental health of everybody in that community. We try to get around the endogeneity. I think their paper is a little bit closer to this. And to the extent that they do find these stronger results in the workers that go into unemployment, completely consistent with this previous literature. But what I think is so interesting about the results is all of these results on the stairs. That's completely new. And so I would encourage the authors to emphasize that even more. This is really interesting. And so really, why are the stairs so affected? And I think there could be some additional tests that they could do. So one thing I would want to look at would be, is it this anxiety that I may lose my job? And so some sort of measure of a prediction of how likely it would be to go into sort of either a job loss or to have to go into unemployment. So thinking about how easy would it be for me to replace my job? The other thing I would think about, which the authors do one test looking at how many of your coworkers stay, but just how different is the acquirer and the target? And then there is an M&A literature that looks at this, looks at things like cross-border deals, things like this, where there's going to be more cultural differences. And that might be just a measure of change. How much of this declining mental health is just because suddenly my work has changed and I'm uncomfortable with the change. And then I feel bad to say this given all of the tables and figures, but I would like to see more on the job loss, especially by these different cross-sectional cuts, just given this existing literature on job loss and mental health. Okay, so can't discuss a paper in empirical corporate without discussing about endogeneity. So let me go through the 3 concerns and talk about how worried I am about any of them. So the first story is reverse causality. So declining mental health led to the M&A event. The second concern is some sort of omitted variable. So some sort of shock hits the firm. So let's think about some sort of declining profitability. I'm thinking about maybe increased foreign competition. It hits the firm or it hits the industry. It makes it less desirable to be employed in this industry. And this could lead to declining mental health, and it could lead to consolidation. And then the last one is the selection. So, I think about it in the context of a PAM model, a positive assortative matching, where just sort of the worst workers are matching to the low quality firms, and then the low quality firms end up merging. So thinking about the first one with the reverse causality, to really believe the story, I think it has to be driven by declining mental health in the top employees within the firm. And so I think one simple way to sort of test this would be just to exclude the top employees from within the firm. If this is coming from changes in the bottom 50% of the employees, it's hard for me to believe reverse causality is driving this story. In terms of this omitted variable, if I try to think about alternative stories here, everything I came to was industry-based. So some sort of shock to the industry that made the industry less profitable and led to increased consolidation. And to the extent that this is driven by some sort of industry shock, then I think including an industry times year fixed effect should absorb most of this. And in the paper, the authors do have something which they call sector times year fixed effects. I just wasn't entirely sure what sector was. So to the extent that this is a relatively fine-grained measure of industry, then I think I'm not so worried about this, but I would also like to see the results both with and without the industry times year fixed effects, just to see how much is being absorbed once we add that. And then in terms of the selection story, honestly, I'm also not that worried. One of the things they require is they require that the workers employed for at least 1 year. And given that they've got worker fixed effects and their regressions, I think the only way this could really be driving the story is maybe these workers join right before that 1 year measure, and you get low quality workers that join right before the firm goes into a merger because it's already sort of a declining firm of some kind. So I guess you could exclude workers that haven't been at the firm for 2 or 3 years. If the results are really similar, I again would not be too worried about these kind of selection stories. And then my last big comment is on the pre-trends. And so this one is the plot for their mental health indicator. And what you see is the effect is strongest in year -1. And this is true for pretty much all of their measures. And so, if you first see that, you're like, oh, pre-trend. But in the context of this paper, it makes sense. So mergers don't happen overnight. You've got to go in, you sort of do the deal. There's a lot of reorganization that occurs right before the merger event. So one just kind of more big picture question is, if we really think the merger event starts in year -1, should year -1 be counted as a pre-treatment year? I think possibly at least just throw it out if it's sort of this in-between year. And then I tried to look in to see, how long does it typically take a merger to be completed? It is really hard to get data on this, particularly for the small firms that tend to be in this sample. To the extent it's useful, the best I could find was sort of a mid-market deal in the US pre-COVID was taking about 6 months to close. So this makes sense. This is consistent with them observing these pre-trends. But again, given that it is a pre-trend and pre-trends in general make us a bit nervous, I would like to see a couple different cross-sectional cuts, because this pre-trend is driven by indeed this fact that M&As are occurring ex ante, there's the negotiation, the transformation that occurs before the actual M&A announcement date, then I would expect this would be more of a pre-trend for bigger firms. And so if you plotted the pre-trend, separately for big firms and then separately for small firms, and I'm assuming you could cut by month for the small firms. And if you show for the small firms, it really is concentrated in those last 6 months right before the event, then I would be very convinced of the author's interpretation of this. I think the other way to think about it is that if the M&A is going to adversely impact your employees, you're probably going to try to hide this information from your employees. But it's going to leak out to the top executives first, and then it's going to sort of filter down to the lower ranking employees. And so again, if you plotted the pre-trends looking at top executives relative to the lower ranked employees within the firm, you should see less of a pre-trend in the lower ranked employees within a firm. Again, if I see that, then I go, absolutely, I completely agree with the author's interpretation. I'm not going to worry about these pre-trends. Okay, so I just have a few more minor comments. And the first one is I've worked on diagnosis codes in US data, and they're really messy. And so I don't know, how you're working with them in the Swedish data. In the US data, one of the issues that comes up is that doctors can fill in 3 diagnosis codes. So I wasn't sure if you're using all 3 diagnosis codes, or maybe this doesn't apply in the Swedish setting. My other concern is that there's a lot of stigma with getting a mental illness diagnosis. And so my concern is that some of these groups, and I go back to this interesting finding with blue collar, I would assume blue collar workers would find it hard to get a diagnosis of mental illness relative to some other groups of employees. And so doctors may be reluctant to give it to them right when they're already battling with a mental illness. And so I worry that this measure is going to be a bit noisier and messier, particularly in the cross section. And when I look at the means, it does look like the measure of mental illness and the measure of are you taking some kind of medication to treat mental illness are so highly correlated. It doesn't seem like the authors are getting that much more by also using these diagnosis codes. So I actually just prefer the measure of are you taking some sort of medication that treats mental illness, and use this as your primary variable. But one small point on that is, again, getting back to the interpretation of the relative magnitudes for these subgroups, is you would probably want to exclude any individual in the subgroup that was taking any of these medications before the merger. I mean, as long as this is just coded as a binary variable, are you taking any medication that could address a mental illness, then if you've already been taking one, you can't increase more. And if some subgroups had higher ex ante rates of taking these medication, then all else equal, they can't increase as much. In terms of the cross-sectional tests, I think these are incredibly interesting. I would recommend a bit more of an economic framework in interpreting some of these. And I think I really keep going back to this health literature, looking at it in terms of job loss. And so if you allow me to cite my own paper, some of my work with Wenting Ma and Elena Simonitzi, we look at how M&As impact employees in terms of job loss and wages by their type of occupation. And what we find is that the job losses are really concentrated in these employees engaged in routine tasks. And on the other hand, the employees engaged in high skill jobs, we actually see employment increase in these jobs, and we see wages increase. And so this could be one way to interpret those results on the blue collar. And same thing, thinking about the horizontal mergers. I think, thinking about it in the context of sort of job insecurity. And then I like the results on the individuals who leave and go into unemployment for a year, but I just think it's also fair. This is where you have a lot of endogeneity. The individuals who lose a job and then stay unemployed for a given year, they may just have worse mental health. And so by selecting on them, yes, you find this higher treatment effect, but it's probably not entirely causal. And one last small comment, I love this approach of using these other life events to benchmark the effects, because, without this, I would have no idea how to interpret the economic magnitude of these effects. But the way it's interpreted when you compare them to some of these other events interprets that the evidence for these other events, and I've divorce here plotted, is causal. And my concern here is there's a lot of endogeneity as well. So it could be that as your mental health declines, you're more likely to get divorced. And that's what you're picking up. And the actual causal impact of divorce on mental health is much smaller. Just a point to keep in mind. But in sum, great paper, you know, just absolutely incredible data, straightforward, very believable result. And my suggestions are more just to try to increase some of the interpretation the authors can make with this really cool stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Paige, for a great discussion. Marieke, would you like to respond?
Yes, thanks so much, Paige. Yeah, incredible, useful, and constructive discussion. I think your suggestions are extremely valuable. Yeah, some clarifications maybe. Yeah, so of course there is this, you know, the idea to look at physical health in the pre-period. I think it's a super good idea. But we should be aware that mental health is very correlated. I mean, I remember that I, you know, a long time ago saw this first result. You know, that even so, your mental, we can see it also in the death, increase in death, no? So your mental health can actually manifest itself in cancer, for example. So it's not completely, you know, orthogonal to each other. So you, yeah, that was my comment on that. So yeah, of course we do control for individual fixed effects in our regression. So in that sense, we do, if there is this level differences across individuals in the tendency to seek help, then of course this average we pick up by the individual effects. But I take your point that it would be interesting to see, like, if you have more time, if that's the period that you seek more help indeed. Yeah, and so yeah, the plant closure point very well taken, that I totally agree. And so about for example, the diagnosis codes, these are international standards. So I use exactly the same codes as you use in the US, the ICD codes. And we use, so doctors can put as many ICD codes as they want. And so we look at just the prevalence of mental health diagnosis. And especially, I mean, I learned from my other paper. So if you would identify depression, for example, within the medication in diagnosis codes, it's extremely difficult because the definition of a depression is very opaque. It's not a clear defined ICD code. And that's why we look in this paper at the whole chapter. So chapter F, it's called in the ICD codes, of all the diagnoses that are bunched together for all mental illnesses. So in that sense, the measurement error is less if you just take a wide definition of mental illness. But I agree, it seems to be completely driven by the uptake of psychiatric medication instead of diagnosis. Yeah, what else do I see? Yeah, all these placebo tests are super useful. We didn't look at that at all yet. And one idea we had to look at these selection effects is to look at twins. And so we have been running regressions with one egg twins. So what is nice of twins is, of course, that you can give the brother or sister that is not working at a firm with a merger, that could function as a counterfactual, while you, as the twin that goes through the merger, gets the treatment. So finally, you have an across, so a real diff in diff and not only a difference. But yeah, so we do find, I mean, we have very little, the number of observations goes down a lot. So if you go to the required twin to be employed and maybe in the same sector, you end up with like 380 twins. So we lose the power a little bit. And then we also noticed that if the twin has a shock, the brother and sister also have a shock. So that's, yeah. So I guess they bring each other down. That's our conclusion. Yeah, so neither an ideal sample to test it. But I mean, your other suggestions are super useful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions from the audience?
Yeah, I do. Hi. Thank you, Marieke, for very nice. I think it's very important. Like I personally think that's a very important question, and I think it's important for everyone. My question is more curiosity, because how detailed is the data on the date of the merger? Because there is a variation in depression states over seasonality, for example. So there is the seasonal depression, is SID, I think, and it's been actually linked to risk aversion, that people, like, depending on the season, you are more risk averse or less. But maybe if you have a detail, because if you have variation in the season when the merger is announced, for example, or executed, it might be interesting to see if it has a stronger effect or not. And then it's a direct, I think, policy implication of this. So you just don't do mergers when people are susceptible to, are more inclined to have mental effect, like affecting their mental state or something like this. So if you have that, might be interesting to look at, I think. Maybe adjust for seasonality of the mergers.
Yeah, we have year fixed effects, but not within year.
Yeah.
But we do have the merger date, so yeah, we can actually do this, what you suggest. Yeah.
Yeah, I can send you the paper that I'm referring to. It's by Lisa Kramer. So yeah, that's
no, I know there's.
Yeah, of course, yes, yeah.
Yeah, no, super, good idea. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think Tobin has a question.
Hi, Marieke.
Hi.
So, yeah, very cool paper. Thank you. One question I had a couple of questions, but the first was, I'll stick to one. But so in your sample, are the firms all privately held, or do you have variation in stocks that are publicly traded or maybe going public as a result of the merger? And then there might be some kind of real wealth shock that people are experiencing aside from any wage differentials, right? So in stock holdings or options or something to that extent.
Yeah, we don't make this distinction. We only require them to be incorporated, but not public versus non-public. But of course, yeah, that is a much smaller sample, yeah, of public firms.
Yeah, just because there could be some kind of wealth shock that's occurring that you're not picking up on, and that could give you some.
Yeah, we can do another cut. Yeah, super good. Thanks.
Ramin, I think you had a question.
So I wanted to ask, what are the implications of your study? Like, what should we do? Should we discourage mergers? Should we provide mental health support during mergers, which is a comment that Giovanna also had? So what should my response be in light of the study?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think there are several things you could do. One goal should be to diminish uncertainty. So I think communication towards your employees about what is going to happen or the implications specifically for that group of employees. You see it sometimes in, public firms that reorganize. They're going to be very explicit about, okay, your jobs are not in danger. We're gonna, so being more explicit about the implications would diminish anxiety about the future. Yeah, that's one idea. Of course, you could do all kinds. I mean, the idea that mental health is less stigmatic is quite recent, no? So I think the idea of supplying explicit mental health facilities in the firm would be a great idea, I would say, especially if you see these differences between women acknowledging their distress while men do it less and then they die more. I think there is definitely an argument for being more proactive to help people acknowledge their problems. Yeah, there are a few.
There is a question from Moshe in the chat room, who is asking if you have canceled deals and how much comes from the insurance.
Yeah, we looked. That was our initial idea to address endogeneity. Yeah, and so of course cancelled deals. It's neither. Well, first of all, we don't have a large sample of canceled deals, and then canceled deals is. You can also see that the employees that work at firms that work at canceled deals, they look different. Maybe because there is already pre-period selection into. Because these canceled deals typically take longer. Yeah, so the short answer is yes, we have canceled deals. They're a very small sample, and then they don't seem to be so exogenous or orthogonal to. They're not so random. So that's.
Thank you. Yeah. Pedro Barroso has a question.
Yes, I do. So this is not my literature. I think the paper is very plausible, but I'm worried about omitted variable concerns. For example, say you have two firms and they are mismanaged for some reason, and their stock price is deteriorating and firm prospects are bad. And actually one finds a buyer and is rescued in a merger. But the analysis focuses on the one that finds a buyer and he finds some mental health issues, but the other that was not bought actually ends up having a much deeper restructure or even bankruptcy. So, so my concern is whether underlying issues in the firms being mismanaged that could show up in, say, stock prices deteriorating before, leverage going up. And you do have some results with leverage that line up with that.
Yeah, so so I think your question is first about our sample of firms that we look at. So we are currently not looking at employees that work at a firm that is in the end not gonna go through a merger. And we see, if you look at the employees outside the merging firms, their mental health is worse than the sample of people who work at firms that do experience a merger. So in that sense, your intuition is correct. So it might be that we still look at the positive selection of people that work at firms. It's either because these firms typically hire higher educated individuals or are in industries that require a different skill. And then, yeah, we also think that if you are in a more distressed firm in the pre-period, that already increases your anxiety before. And so in that sense, I forgot to mention that in my presentation. In that sense, I think the diff in diff, or that for us, it's a difference, not a diff in diff. No, it's only you compared to your post-merger self is not ideal. No? So if we have these large increases in the pre-period that Paige also pointed out, no? So I think those are driven by individual differences. But then, that would only diminish the chance for us to find an effect. No? So if you already have a large effect in the pre-period, then the difference with the post-period will be diminished. So yeah, the fact that we find a positive effect, yeah, it could be larger if we would move the event time back in time.
There is one question from Raffaele Corvino, and then we'll conclude. Raffaele Corvino. No.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot for your very interesting paper. That's probably a question related to just the last question, but I was a bit puzzling about, the results about the targets, and the target involved in the M&A, because usually what we know is that, the target benefit a lot from, much more than acquirers, right? If you look at some, abnormal return around the M&A date, then there's a normal return for the targets usually, are very good, right? So I mean, does your paper can say, I mean, something about like the distance between the perception of the market and the internal perception of the employer about M&A. So the market perceives really well about M&A while the workers do not. And in particular, I was big passing about the effect on the distressed firms, because if I am an employee of the firm that is going to I mean, that is very distressed, actually is going to fail, then I can perceive as a safety. I mean, to be acquired by someone else, particularly if the acquirer is a good one. So I mean, this couple of results were were a bit interesting, but a bit passing for me.
Yeah, I think so. When I present this in business schools, this is definitely the experience I've had. That the preconception is really that this is a positive event. A merger is a positive event. It generates value, and we're not denying that at all. So I think so. Also, if you see the size of our effect, it's not that your human capital is collapsing completely. No, so that's why we also wanted to show you that the relative effect of other events in a life. This is not, that likely to diminish the benefits of a merger. We just want to zoom in on the well-being of the employees, and and as you could see, the effects that are larger are also for smaller groups in the firm. So, so even the financial distress, that is still a subset of firms that are affected by that, for example.
And maybe I can add something to this. So one possible effect is that distressed targets are more likely taken over by bad acquirers who are not very good at managing the firm, but just have enough money to take over the company. And then when we take it over, they just resell assets a bit inefficiently. So there's a big literature on fire sales being inefficient. And that's very much in line with this as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Laurent.
So, yeah, thank you. I think it's time to conclude. I had one question, but I just make it like an opening suggestion. Is it would be very interesting to study more like the social cost, right, of acquisitions, and think about what can be done about this externality. I think Ramin started in that, raised this issue, but I think it would be interesting to push it further. Okay, so thank you very much, Marieke, for for great topic. Thank you, Paige, for an excellent discussion. So the next seminar will be held on Tuesday, March 9th. Zolitana Brizgalova from the London Business School will present a paper entitled Bayesian Solutions for the Factor Zoo. We just ran 2 quadrillion models. I think that's a provocative title. That's joint work with Jiantao Wang and Christian Juliat from LSE. So we look forward to seeing you in 1 month. Thank you again.